In the black water behind a moving Soviet cruise ship, Stanislav Kurilov had only seconds to avoid the propeller and begin a swim that would last 3 nights and 2 days. December 1974. A Soviet cruise liner called Sovetski Soyuz was moving south from Vladivostok toward the equator on a voyage designed to avoid foreign port calls. It was a passport-free cruise, one of the few ways a Soviet citizen could approach the open ocean without crossing an official border on paper. Somewhere behind that ship, in the Philippine Sea, Stanislav Kurilov made his move. He went over the stern wearing only a snorkeling mask, fins, and a snorkel. No boat followed him. No one was waiting in the water. The ship kept moving. The first danger was immediate. According to the account published as Escape in the Ocean, Slava Kurilov, he narrowly avoided the suction and violently churning blades of the ship's massive propeller. Before any question of distance, weather, or endurance, there was this: survive the machinery of the vessel he had just abandoned. Then the lights of the ship began to pull away. The scale of the decision became absolute. Behind him was a wake, fading into darkness. Ahead of him was open sea, no food, no fresh water, and no certainty that land could even be reached. He had not stepped into a planned rescue. He had stepped into a test of navigation, endurance, and will in complete isolation. And that raises the question that drives this story. Part 1. A life bounded by borders. What would make an accomplished oceanographer decide that the greater danger was not the sea, but staying where he was? Stanislav Kurilov was not a thrill-seeker stumbling into a reckless act. He was a Soviet oceanographer. The frustration at the center of his life was precise and bureaucratic. While his profession was tied to the sea, his fieldwork was restricted to domestic waters because authorities refused to issue him a passport for overseas expeditions. That one administrative barrier shaped the boundaries of his world. An oceanographer studies a planet connected by water, but Kurilov was confined by a state that decided where he could and could not go. The contradiction is almost unbearable in its simplicity. His expertise pointed outward. Policy forced him inward. The restriction was not abstract. It directly cut him off from the kind of work that defined international ocean research. He could not simply sign onto expeditions abroad. He could not move freely from one sea to another. The ocean, the subject of his life's work, was visible and yet politically closed. For many people, such a system produces resignation. For Kurilov, the available record suggests something else: pressure building over years. Every denied opportunity made the confinement more concrete. Every limit placed on movement would have carried a special sting for someone whose profession depended on crossing horizons. The sea can symbolize freedom too easily in stories like this. But here, the contrast is grounded in fact. He was trained to work in an international environment and repeatedly prevented from entering it. He knew what existed beyond Soviet waters, and he knew he was being kept from it. By the time he boarded that ship in 1974, the leap into darkness did not come out of nowhere. It came after years in which the official answer to outward movement had been no. Part 2. The door that closed in 1970. There is one documented moment that captures the scale of what Kurilov was being denied. In 1970, Soviet authorities blocked him from participating in joint underwater projects with Jacques-Yves Cousteau, the internationally renowned explorer. That single fact matters because it turns a general frustration into a visible turning point. This was not merely a matter of missing leisure travel or personal adventure. It was a professional exclusion at the highest level. A Soviet oceanographer prepared for serious work, was prevented from joining underwater projects with one of the most recognized names in marine exploration. For someone devoted to the ocean, this would not have looked like a minor inconvenience. It would have looked like the closing of a door onto the wider world of his own discipline. Scientific work depends on access to places, to colleagues, to vessels, to projects. When access is denied, ambition is not simply delayed, it can be stranded. The blocked Cousteau collaboration stands at the center of Kurilov's story because it shows the larger pattern in one sharp image. He was not refusing an ordinary life out of vague dissatisfaction. He had seen a real path toward meaningful international work, and the state had cut it off. So when later accounts describe his escape as a quest for freedom, the word is not empty. Freedom, in his case, meant movement, professional purpose, and the right to place knowledge above borders. By 1970, the system had made clear that these things would not be granted. What do you do when your life's work depends on the very world you are forbidden to enter? Part 3. The Open Ocean. 4 years later, Kurilov answered that question in the most irreversible way possible. After the jump, there was no dramatic speech, no audience, no guarantee of success. There was only the ocean and time. The verified record says Kurilov navigated using the stars. He spent 3 nights and 2 days in the water, without food or fresh water, and covered approximately 100 kilometers before reaching land. Those facts alone are severe enough. They describe not a symbolic crossing, but a prolonged physical ordeal in which every hour mattered. At sea, progress is difficult to measure. In darkness, distance can feel imaginary. A swimmer can move through enormous effort and still see nothing change except the position of the stars overhead. Navigation by starlight meant that his survival depended not just on endurance, but on maintaining direction while fatigue accumulated. The lack of food and fresh water deepens the picture. This was not an operation supplied by hidden equipment or a support team. He had entered the Philippine Sea with only the most minimal gear: mask, fins, snorkel. Everything else had to come from experience, judgment, and stamina. There is a temptation in retelling stories like this to inflate them with invented scenes. But the documented outline is powerful without embellishment. 3 nights, 2 days, open water, no fresh water, no food. Roughly 100 kilometers. By any standard, that is a brutal transit. And all the while, another uncertainty hung over the effort. Even if he survived the sea, what would happen when he reached shore? Escape from one system did not automatically mean safety in the next moment. Land would not end the story. It would only begin a different kind of test. Still, before any investigation, before any migration, before any new life, there was this stretch of water where freedom existed only as a direction. Part 4, land but not safety. And where the price of pursuing it was measured in strokes under the stars. Kurilov did reach land. That fact alone confirms the success of what had seemed almost impossible when he vanished into the ship's wake. But reaching shore did not mean immediate release into a new life. According to Time Note, Philippine authorities investigated him for roughly 6 months in Cagayan de Oro and Manila because they suspected he might be a Soviet spy. That suspicion is crucial to understanding the aftermath. To the authorities receiving him, he was not simply a swimmer or an escapee with an extraordinary story. He was also a Soviet citizen arriving under astonishing circumstances during a period when such cases could not be taken at face value. So, The man who had crossed the sea to escape political confinement entered another form of uncertainty. The setting had changed from open ocean to offices, interviews, and official scrutiny. But the central problem remained unresolved. Other people still had the power to decide whether he could move on. This phase of the story often receives less attention than the jump itself, because it lacks the immediate drama of the night sea. But in another sense, it reveals the full reality of escape. Survival is not only physical, it is administrative, legal, and psychological. Kurilov had proven that he could endure exhaustion, thirst, isolation, and navigation in darkness. Now he had to endure delay, suspicion, and the possibility that his motives would be misunderstood. Roughly 6 months is a long time after an ordeal of this scale. It suggests a long wait between the act of self-liberation and any secure recognition of what he had done. The question that had driven him into the ocean still had not fully been answered. Could he actually build a life beyond the system he had left behind? Part 5, Crossing into a New Life. Or would freedom remain a horizon that kept receding, even after he had reached shore? The answer, eventually, was yes. Following his escape, Kurilov emigrated to Canada and later settled in Israel. The movement denied to him for so long began, at last, to open. This part of his story matters because it proves the jump was not an isolated act of desperation with no future beyond it. It was the beginning of a different life trajectory. First Canada, then Israel, 2 stages in a path that carried him permanently out of the confinement that had defined his years in the Soviet Union. Emigration is often described in abstract terms, but here it can be understood in direct contrast to the earlier facts. A man once restricted to domestic waters was now able to cross countries and build a life internationally. A man once denied a passport for overseas expeditions had, through extraordinary means, forced open the possibility of movement. The sea crossing remains the dramatic center of the story, but emigration gives it meaning. Without what followed, the jump would be only a survival tale. With what followed, it becomes something larger, a passage from prohibition to mobility. There is also a quieter significance in the order of events. The Soviet state had tried to define the limits of Kurilov's world through documentation and denial. His route out was not through permission, but through endurance. Yet once out, he still had to enter the ordinary systems of life elsewhere: settlement, work, belonging. Freedom was not only escape from something, it was also the slow creation of a place to stand. By the time he settled in Israel, the meaning of that night in December 1974 had expanded. He had not simply survived the Pacific. He had crossed from a life controlled by blocked exits into one where a future could actually be built. In Israel, Kurilov worked as a researcher at the Israel Oceanographic and Limnological Research Institute. That final fact brings the story full circle with remarkable clarity. He did not escape only to disappear into anonymity. He reached the international scientific life that had once been withheld from him. The profession at the center of his identity remained the same: oceanographic research. What changed was the world around it. The barriers that had confined his work to domestic waters no longer held. There is something deeply striking in that outcome. The man who had been blocked from overseas expeditions and specifically prevented from joining joint underwater projects with Cousteau eventually became part of an institution dedicated to studying water on an international horizon. His life after escape did not reject the sea that had nearly killed him. It returned to it, but on different terms. That is why Kurilov's story endures. Not because it is a spectacle of danger, though the danger was real. Not because a leap from a moving ship is cinematic, though it is. It endures because the action in the dark makes sense only when seen beside the years before it and the life after it. A restricted oceanographer, a blocked opportunity in 1970, a passport-free cruise in December 1974, a jump from the stern with only mask, fins, and snorkel, a narrow escape from the propeller, 3 nights and 2 days navigating by the stars without food or fresh water across roughly 100 kilometers, months of suspicion in the Philippines, immigration to Canada, settlement in Israel, research at the Israel Oceanographic and Limnological Research Institute. Taken together, those facts describe a single continuous pursuit: the effort to align one human life with the widest possible horizon. For Kurilov, absolute freedom was never an abstract slogan. It was movement. It was work. It was the chance to live in the same open world he had spent his life studying. And one night in the Philippine Sea, he was willing to risk everything for it. If this story brings up feelings of desperation or isolation, consider reaching out to local mental health support services or a trusted crisis resource in your area.